We voted, Mom. You're no longer family. We have passed. My son said that standing at the head of my own Thanksgiving table, in the house my husband and I built with our own 2 hands, while his wife sat beside him with a smile she wasn't even trying to hide. The room went completely silent. 12 relatives, forks frozen halfway to their mouths, waiting to see whether the woman they'd known their whole lives was finally going to break. Before we go any further, thank you so much for being here with me today. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one and it truly means the world to me. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and meaningful storytelling. Names and settings are coincidental, but what it has to say, that part is worth holding on to. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I reached under my chair where a plain manila folder had been sitting in my handbag for exactly 3 weeks, waiting for a moment I hoped I'd never actually need it for. I set it down gently on the table in front of my son. Since we're voting tonight, I said, here's mine. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened next. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer, one of the only women in this state licensed for high-rise work when I started, and in all that time, I learned exactly one unshakable truth. Buildings don't fail all at once. They fail slowly, quietly, along a crack nobody bothered to look for until it was already too late to stop. I had been watching a crack form in my own family for 4 months. I hadn't said a word about it to anyone. That folder in front of my son didn't just contain paperwork. It contained every quiet thing I'd noticed and every quiet thing I'd done about it, while he and his wife believed I hadn't noticed anything at all. It would take Tyler almost a full minute to work up the courage to open that folder. But the crack itself had started 4 months earlier on a Sunday afternoon that seemed at the time like nothing at all. He and Brooke had started coming by more often that spring, which I'll admit I noticed and, foolishly, welcomed without asking myself hard enough why. For nearly 2 years after Frank died, Tyler had called on Sundays out of what felt like obligation more than desire. A 10-minute conversation, sometimes shorter, always ending with some version of "things are just so busy right now, Mom." Then almost overnight the calls turned into visits. Brooke started bringing over containers of soup she swore she'd made herself, though I recognized the particular plastic lid from the deli 2 towns over. Tyler started staying long enough to help with small chores around the house he'd never once offered to help with before. Clearing gutters, checking the furnace, the kind of attentive son behavior that should have delighted me and instead, somewhere underneath my gratitude, made a small and stubborn part of me uneasy in a way I couldn't yet name. I told myself I was being unfair. Grief does strange things to a family, and I reasoned that perhaps losing his father had simply, finally, made my son understand what he stood to lose in me as well. I wanted so badly to believe that version of events that I didn't look very hard for any other explanation, not at first. The account came up on a Sunday in July, over coffee at my own kitchen table, the same table Frank had built with me 41 years earlier out of reclaimed oak from a barn 2 counties over. Tyler brought it up so casually, sandwiched between a comment about the Cubs and a question about whether I'd had my gutters cleaned, that I nearly missed how deliberately it had been placed there. "You know, Mom," he said, not quite looking at me, stirring sugar into his coffee with more attention than the task required, "it might make things easier if we set up a joint account together. Just for convenience. In case anything ever comes up suddenly. A repair, a medical thing, anything you'd need help handling quickly. I worry about you out here on your own." I remember exactly what I said back because I've turned it over more times than I can count since. I said, "That's thoughtful of you, sweetheart," and I meant it at the time, the way you mean things when you desperately want to believe the good version of someone rather than interrogate the small alarm going off quietly somewhere in the back of your mind. We opened the account together that same week at the credit union on 5th Street, and I signed the paperwork without reading it as closely as I would have read a beam calculation, because some part of me had decided, consciously or not, that scrutinizing my own son's intentions felt like a betrayal I wasn't prepared to commit. The doctor's name came up in September at a dinner I'd hosted for Tyler's birthday, dropped into the conversation with the same careful casualness as the account had been. Brooke mentioned, apropos of almost nothing, that her cousin worked at a wonderful geriatric practice downtown. Just in case I ever wanted a checkup, nothing serious, just good to have a relationship with someone before you actually need one. I remember laughing a little at the phrase "before you actually need one" because I was 68, not 90, still driving myself everywhere, still doing the crossword in under 20 minutes most mornings, still sharper with numbers than either of them had ever managed to be. I let the comment pass. I told myself it was simply thoughtfulness dressed up awkwardly, the same way I'd told myself about the account. It was a conversation in October that finally cracked something open in me that I couldn't talk myself back out of noticing. I'd stopped by Tyler and Brooke's rented condo unannounced, wanting to drop off a jacket of his father's he'd once admired, and I'd heard their voices through the screen door before I ever knocked, raised in the particular strained tone of people who believe themselves alone. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I want to be honest about that because I've never been a woman who makes a habit of listening at doors. But I heard my own name, and then I heard Brooke's voice, flat and businesslike in a way I'd never once heard her use in front of me, say, "The bank account is a start, but it's not enough on its own, Tyler. If we're going to move on the house before the restaurant debt catches up with us, we need something more official. Power of attorney or a guardianship, something a judge would actually honor." I stood on that porch a long moment, jacket still folded over my arm, and I did not knock. I turned around, walked back to my car, and drove home in a silence I can only describe as the particular quiet that settles over you the instant you finally, completely believe something you'd spent months refusing to consider. I didn't confront them that week. I understand looking back that some people might have. I am not built that way, and 40 years of engineering had taught me something else entirely. That the worst thing you can do, discovering a crack in a structure, is to start hammering at it in a panic before you understand exactly how deep it runs, and exactly what's holding the rest of the building up around it. So instead, that same week, I called the one person I trusted enough to help me find out. I didn't call anyone that night, not right away. Instead, I went out to the garage, to the workshop Frank had built along the back wall the same summer we'd poured the foundation for the house itself. And I sat down on the old stool he'd used for 40 years, surrounded by tools that hadn't moved an inch since the week he died. I hadn't touched much of it in the 2 years since. Franny Callahan. No, that's not right, that was someone else's housekeeper in a different story I told once. Forgive me, let me start that thought again. I hadn't touched much of it in the 2 years since Frank died. His level still hung on its hook by the window. The bubble perfectly centered the way he always left it, half out of habit and half, I think, out of some superstition neither of us ever named out loud. The idea that a level left crooked overnight meant something in the house itself had shifted. I sat there a long while that evening with my coat still on, looking at the pegboard where his hand tools hung in the exact arrangement he'd kept them in since 1987, and I found myself talking out loud to a man who'd been gone 2 years. The way I still do sometimes when the quiet gets too large to sit inside of alone. "You'd have seen it months ago," I told him. "You always did see things faster than I let myself." Frank had been the instinctive one in our marriage, the partner who trusted his gut before the numbers ever confirmed it, while I was the one who needed the calculations to line up before I'd commit to believing anything at all. It had made us a good team for 41 years. His instinct pointing toward a problem, my patience working out exactly how bad it actually was before either of us acted. I missed that balance more in that workshop than I had missed almost anything else about him since the funeral. I didn't just need comfort that night. I needed his particular kind of clarity, the kind that used to cut straight through my tendency to give people, especially our son, more benefit of the doubt than the evidence in front of me actually supported. I thought about Tyler as a boy in that workshop, 7 or 8 years old, standing on a milk crate so he could reach the workbench, handing his father screws one at a time with the fierce concentration only a child gives to being helpful to someone he adores. Frank used to let him help build things that didn't strictly need building, just to keep that look on his face a little longer. I wondered, sitting there, exactly when that boy had become a man capable of standing in his own kitchen discussing power of attorney and guardianship over his mother like line items on a spreadsheet, and whether Frank, if he were still here, would have seen that transformation coming the way he'd seen so many other things coming that I'd been too hopeful or too tired to notice myself. I don't believe grief excuses cruelty. I want to say that plainly because I spent a good portion of that evening trying to talk myself into exactly that excuse on Tyler's behalf. That losing his father young, that watching me manage a house and a career and eventually a widowhood mostly alone, that some of what I was seeing in him now might simply be a wound I hadn't tended to carefully enough as his mother. I sat with that thought a long while, turning it over the way I used to turn over a stress calculation that didn't quite balance, looking for the error in my own reasoning rather than accepting the answer I didn't want. I couldn't find the error. That was the difficult, clarifying truth of that evening. Grief might explain distance. It might explain silence or short tempers or years of missed Sunday calls. It did not explain a joint account opened under the guise of convenience, or a doctor's name dropped with rehearsed casualness at a birthday dinner, or the particular businesslike coldness in Brooke's voice through a screen door discussing power of attorney like a project timeline. Those weren't wounds. Those were plans, and plans require a kind of clear-eyed intention that grief, however real, does not typically produce on its own. I'm not going to be the crack that brings this house down, I said out loud, to Frank's level still hanging perfectly balanced on its hook, to the tools he'd left arranged exactly the way he wanted them found. But I'm also not going to pretend I didn't see it forming, the way I used to pretend for you when you'd notice something wrong 3 weeks before I was ready to admit it myself. I sat there until the workshop had gone properly cold, and when I finally stood up to go back inside, I did it with a clarity I hadn't had in months. Not anger yet, not exactly, but something steadier and more useful than anger. I understood I could not simply wait to see what Tyler and Brooke intended to do next, hoping I was somehow wrong about all of it. I needed to know, precisely and completely, exactly what I was dealing with, the same way I'd have insisted on knowing before I ever signed off on a single beam calculation in 40 years of engineering work. The next morning I called Dale Whitfield. Dale Whitfield had been handling odds and ends for Frank and me since the early 90s. A property line dispute with our old neighbors, the paperwork when we refinanced the house to add the sunroom Frank had wanted for our 25th anniversary, the will we'd updated twice over the decades as our lives changed shape around us. He was close to 70 himself now, mostly retired, keeping only the clients he trusted enough to still call friends rather than business. When I called him that Monday morning and asked if he had time to see me that week, he cleared his Wednesday afternoon before I'd even finished explaining why. His office hadn't changed much in 30 years. The same heavy walnut desk, the same wall of law books he claimed to still consult, though I suspected, much like my late husband's tools, they mostly stayed for the comfort of their presence rather than active use. A photograph of his late wife sat on the credenza, faded now at the edges, and I found myself, not for the first time, grateful to have a friend who understood a particular kind of missing someone the same way I did. I told him everything, start to finish. The account Tyler had suggested for convenience, the doctor's name dropped too casually at his birthday dinner, and finally the conversation I'd overheard through the screen door, Brooke's flat, businesslike voice discussing power of attorney and guardianship as though describing a project timeline rather than a plan against her own mother-in-law. Dale listened without interrupting, the way he always had, taking notes in his small, careful handwriting, and when I finished he sat back in his chair and was quiet a long moment before he spoke. "Barbara," he said, "I want to be honest with you about how serious this actually is, because I don't think you've fully let yourself sit with it yet. What you're describing isn't a family disagreement. It's the early stages of what's called financial elder abuse, and unfortunately I've seen versions of this before, more than I'd like to admit. It rarely announces itself loudly. It builds exactly the way you've described. Small, reasonable-sounding steps, each one easy to explain away on its own." Hearing him name it, that plainly did something strange to my chest, a mixture of relief and grief arriving together. Relief that I hadn't imagined the wrongness of it, grief that the son I'd raised had become someone capable of this at all. "What do I do?" I asked him. "I don't want to destroy him, Dale. I just want to protect what Frank and I built, and I want to understand exactly how far this has already gone before I decide what happens next. Dale nodded slowly and reached for a legal pad. Then let's build this the way you'd build anything else you've ever worked on. Carefully and from the foundation up. He walked me through it methodically, the same way I imagine I once walked contractors through a structural plan. First he explained we needed to understand the joint account fully. Not close it outright, not yet, because doing that too soon might tip Tyler off before we understood the full shape of what he and Brooke were planning. Instead, Dale suggested quietly monitoring the account's activity while we gathered everything else we needed. Second, he raised the house itself. Your home is currently in your name outright, which is good, but it's still vulnerable if anyone were to successfully petition for guardianship over your affairs. I'd recommend moving it into a revocable trust, with you as sole trustee and beneficiary. It accomplishes two things. It protects the property from being easily seized through any legal maneuvering, and it gives you the flexibility to decide, entirely on your own terms, what happens to that house and when. Third, and this was the part that made my stomach tighten even as I understood its necessity, he raised the question of evidence. If they are indeed building toward a guardianship petition, Barbara, the strongest thing you can do to protect yourself is document their intentions clearly in their own words, before they ever file anything. Illinois is a one-party consent state for phone recordings, which means if you're a participant in a conversation, you're legally permitted to record it without informing the other party. If you're ever in a position to record Tyler or Brooke discussing this plan directly, that recording could become the single most important piece of evidence you have. I sat with that a long moment, turning it over the way I'd turn over any calculation that didn't sit comfortably with me at first. You're asking me to deceive my own son. I'm suggesting, Dale said carefully, that your son and his wife are already deceiving you in a way that could cost you your home and your independence, and that documenting the truth isn't the same thing as manufacturing a lie. You're not creating evidence of something that isn't happening, Barbara. You're simply making sure that if it comes down to your word against theirs in front of a judge, the truth has something solid to stand on. I thought about the level hanging in Frank's workshop, perfectly balanced, and about 40 years of trusting calculations over instinct alone, of never signing off on anything until I'd verified it thoroughly enough to stake my name on it. I understood, sitting in Dale's office that afternoon, that this was no different, however much it hurt to apply the same discipline to my own son. All right, I told him. Start with the trust. I'll handle finding the right moment for the rest myself. Dale studied me a long moment, the particular careful study of a man who'd known me long enough to recognize when I'd made up my mind completely. You understand, once we start this, there's no comfortable way to walk it back if it turns out to be as bad as you suspect. I don't want a comfortable way to walk it back, I told him. I want to know the truth, and I want to be standing on solid ground by the time I have to face it. The call came from Tyler himself, less than 2 weeks after my afternoon in Dale's office, and I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear thinking how strange it was that the very conversation I'd been quietly bracing for arrived wearing such an ordinary, almost cheerful voice. Mom, I wanted to ask you something, he said, and I want you to feel completely free to say no. That opening alone should have told me everything, the particular practiced humility people use right before they ask for something they've already decided they're entitled to. Brooke and I have been thinking about downsizing for a while. The condo's more than we need, honestly, and the guest cottage out back has just been sitting empty since Dad passed. Would it be all right if we moved in there for a while? Just to simplify things. We'd be close by if you ever needed anything. I stood very still in my kitchen a long moment, turning the request over the way I'd learned over the past 2 weeks, to turn over everything Tyler said to me now. Close by if you ever needed anything. I understood, hearing that phrase, exactly what kind of closeness he actually wanted. Not proximity for my benefit, but proximity for theirs, a front row seat to whatever daily evidence of decline they intended to build their case around. I told him yes. I wanted to be honest about why. Dale had cautioned me gently, that I didn't owe Tyler anything simply because he was my son, that I was allowed to set boundaries even amid an investigation I hadn't yet told him I was conducting. But some old, stubborn instinct in me understood that saying yes gave me something valuable too, a closer vantage point of my own rather than only Tyler's. If they were going to build a case against me from a distance, I decided I would rather watch it get built up close on ground I still controlled completely. They moved in during the first week of November, and within days, the cottage began revealing things Tyler had clearly never intended for me to see. Boxes arrived faster than two people downsizing from a condo should reasonably generate, and one afternoon, carrying over a casserole dish under the guise of neighborliness, I noticed a stack of mail on the cottage's kitchen counter that Tyler hadn't yet gotten around to hiding. Collection notices, 3 of them from a commercial lender, addressed to Hensley and Marsh Hospitality LC. I hadn't known my son had a business. I said nothing to him directly. Instead, that evening I called Dale, and within a few days, working through channels I still don't fully understand the mechanics of but trust completely given 30 years of watching him work, he came back to me with a fuller picture than I was prepared to absorb all at once. Tyler and Brooke had opened a restaurant 18 months earlier. A small, ambitious farm-to-table place downtown called Marsh and Vine, financed almost entirely through a commercial loan and 2 maxed credit lines, with Tyler's name on all of it and Brooke listed as co-signer. It had closed after 11 months, the way so many restaurants do, leaving behind $58,000 in outstanding debt across the loan and the credit lines combined, plus a landlord dispute over an early lease termination that had added several thousand more in legal fees neither of them had ever mentioned to me at all. I thought back, sitting with Dale's report spread across my kitchen table, to the 18 months I'd actually lived through during that same stretch of time. Tyler mentioning vaguely that he was between projects, Brooke commenting once at a family dinner that they'd tried something new for a while but it didn't work out, no big deal. I remembered believing at the time that whatever it was had been small enough not to warrant asking further questions about. I understood now that I had simply been handed a carefully sanded down version of a much larger collapse. The same way a contractor might show you a wall with fresh paint over it and never mention the water damage underneath. The pattern, once Dale laid it out clearly, was worse than the debt itself. 3 separate loans over the past 2 years, each one described to family as temporary. A bridge loan for inventory, a short-term line to cover payroll during a slow season, a personal loan from Brooke's own mother that had apparently gone unpaid long enough to end that relationship entirely. According to a strained voicemail Dale's contact had somehow tracked down reference to. None of it had ever actually been temporary. Each loan had simply rolled into the next, a structure with no real foundation beneath it at all, propped up by nothing but the hope that the next thing would finally work out. "This is what you're up against, Barbara," Dale told me over the phone that evening, his voice careful, direct. $58,000 in hard debt. A business that failed within a year, and a couple with no clear plan for recovering from any of it on their own. People in that position don't usually go looking for a slow, honest way out. They look for the fastest one available to them. And unfortunately, in this case, the fastest one available happens to be your house. I sat with that for a long while after we hung up, looking out my kitchen window at the lit windows of the guest cottage across the yard, where my son and his wife were, at that very moment, presumably eating dinner together as though nothing at all was wrong. I thought about the boy who used to hand his father screws one at a time on a milk crate in that workshop, and about the man now living 40 feet from my back door with a folder's worth of secrets I was only just beginning to fully understand. I did not confront him that night either. I had learned by then exactly how much I still needed to know before I could afford to. I asked Dale to move on the trust the same week we confirmed the restaurant debt, and I asked him separately to look carefully at the joint account Tyler had talked me into back in July, the one still described in my own mind months later by the word he'd used to sell it to me, convenience. What Dale found took him only a few days, and it landed harder than I expected it to, even after everything else I'd already absorbed that month. "The account itself hasn't been touched for large withdrawals," he told me, sitting across from me at his desk with a printed statement between us, which I suspect means they're being patient, waiting until they have either full legal authority or your outright cooperation before they move any real money through it. But Barbara, look at this. He pointed to a line near the bottom of the statement, a small recurring transaction I'd never once noticed on my own monthly review, because it was so small it read almost like a bank fee. $2.14, transferred out to an external account, every single week since August. That's nothing, I said. That can't be what you're worried about. It's not the amount that matters, Dale said. It's what it tells us. That's a verification transfer, Barbara. The kind banks use to confirm an external account is properly linked before someone attempts a larger transfer later. Someone has already linked an outside account to this one and quietly tested it for times now over the past several months. They're not stealing from you yet. They're making absolutely certain the pipe works before they turn the valve. I felt something cold settle low in my stomach, the particular cold of understanding finally and completely that I hadn't been paranoid at all. I'd been exactly right, and worse, I'd been right for months without letting myself fully believe it. Freeze it, I told him. All of it. Today if you can manage it. Dale was already reaching for his phone before I'd finished the sentence. It took the better part of that afternoon, sitting together in his office while he worked through the credit union's fraud department, explaining the situation delicately enough not to trigger any immediate confrontation with Tyler, framing it instead as a routine security concern I was raising as the primary account holder. By 4 o'clock, the account showed frozen status on both our screens, external transfers disabled entirely, any future withdrawal requiring my physical presence and signature at a branch. He'll notice, Dale warned me. Possibly within days if he checks the account for any reason at all. Let him notice, I said, and found saying it, that some of the fear I'd been carrying for weeks had finally started converting into something closer to resolve. I'd rather he notice a locked door than an open one. The trust took longer, nearly 3 weeks of paperwork and county filings, but by the second week of November, the house on Birchwood Lane sat fully protected inside the Hensley Family Trust, myself named sole trustee and beneficiary, with language Dale had drafted specifically to withstand any future guardianship challenge someone might attempt to bring against me. I signed the final documents at his desk on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and felt doing it an odd mixture of grief and relief arriving together, the same combination I'd felt in his office weeks earlier when he'd first named clearly what was happening to me. You understand, Dale said gently once the signing was finished, that none of this stops Tyler from trying. It only makes certain that if he does, he won't succeed. I understand, I told him. I'm not doing this to stop him from trying. I gave up on that possibility the night I stood on his porch and didn't knock. I folded the copy of the trust document he handed me and placed it carefully in my handbag, beside a growing collection of papers that had, over the past month, become something closer to armor than paperwork. I'm doing this to make sure that when he does try, it cost him considerably more than it costs me. Dale walked me to the door of his office that afternoon, and paused there a moment before I stepped out into the parking lot. There's one more thing you should consider, Barbara, and I want you to sit with it before you decide, not answer me today. If you're truly prepared for whatever comes next, the single strongest thing you could still do is capture them discussing the plan directly in their own words, while they still believe you know nothing at all. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard through the screen door in October, Brooke's flat, businesslike voice discussing power of attorney like a project timeline, and I understood exactly what Dale was suggesting, and exactly how much it would cost me, emotionally, to deliberately place myself in a position to hear more of it. I'll think about it, I told him, though some part of me, driving home that evening past the guest cottage where my son now lived 40 feet from my back door, already suspected I'd made up my mind the moment Dale said it out loud. The opportunity came sooner than I expected, and in a form I hadn't anticipated at all. I'd taken to leaving my back porch light off most evenings that November, A small habit that let me sit in my own kitchen after dark without announcing to the cottage across the yard exactly when I was awake and when I wasn't. It was on one of those quiet evenings close to 10 that I heard raised voices carrying across the yard through a cracked cottage window, clear enough in the cold night air that I understood immediately I was hearing something I'd been waiting weeks to hear. I did not go outside. I did something Dale had walked me through carefully 2 days earlier, sitting in his office with a patience I hadn't expected from a conversation about phone settings. I picked up my own cell phone, dialed Tyler's number and let it ring exactly once before hanging up, a habit I'd started weeks earlier under the guise of checking he'd seen my earlier text. Enough times by then that neither of them would think twice about a call that didn't connect. Instead, I opened the voice memo application Dale had shown me how to use, set my phone on the windowsill facing the cottage, window cracked open just enough to catch sound, and stepped back into the shadow of my own kitchen to wait. I am not proud of standing there in the dark recording my son without his knowledge. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters and because Dale had told me gently that I was allowed to feel the full weight of that discomfort even while doing something legal and necessary. Illinois law permitted it, a one-party consent state, meaning I needed only my own knowledge of the recording, not theirs, since I was capturing sound audible from my own property rather than intercepting a private call. Legal permission and moral ease are not always the same thing, and I felt that gap keenly, standing in my dark kitchen with my own heart hammering, listening to my son's voice rise and fall through a cracked window 40 feet away. What I captured over the following 20 minutes confirmed everything Dale and I had suspected, and delivered it in language colder than I'd braced myself for. Brooke's voice came through first, clipped and instructional in a tone I recognized instantly from the conversation I'd overheard through the screen door weeks earlier. You need to be specific with Dr. Ferris, Tyler, not vague. Vague doesn't get a diagnosis. Tell him she's repeated herself in conversation. Pick a specific instance even if you have to stretch it a little. Tell him she left the stove on once. Tell him she got confused about a date recently. The exact details matter less than sounding certain when you say them. She hasn't done any of that, Tyler said, and there was something in his voice that gave me, for one brief moment, a flicker of the sun I remembered. Hesitant, uncomfortable, some remnant of conscience still functioning underneath everything else. I don't want to just make things up about her, Brooke. That feels different than everything else we've done. It's not making things up, Brooke said, sharper now. It's framing what's already there in a way a doctor can actually act on. She's 68, Tyler. She lives alone in a house that size. Any doctor is going to want to believe there's some decline happening because statistically, there usually is at her age. We're not inventing a story from nothing. We're just giving Dr. Ferris permission to see what he already expects to see. And if he doesn't agree with us, if he examines her and says she's completely fine, then we try someone else, Brooke said flatly, as though describing a minor scheduling inconvenience rather than a plan to have me declared unfit. There's always another doctor, Tyler. The restaurant debt isn't going anywhere on its own, and neither is the interest on it. We need the house liquid within 6 months, realistically, or we're looking at bankruptcy regardless of what happens with your mother. I'd rather not end up there if there's another way through this. There was a long pause after that, long enough that I nearly reached for my phone to check whether the recording had stopped on its own. When Tyler spoke again, his voice had gone quieter, and whatever hesitation had briefly surfaced seemed to have folded back under something more practical. Thanksgiving's in 3 weeks, he said. If we're doing this, we should probably say something to the family then. Get ahead of it so nobody's blindsided later when we actually file anything. Say something like what? Brooke asked. I don't know. Something that makes it clear in front of everyone that we've already made a decision as a family. That we've thought about this and we're moving forward with it together. It'll make the doctor's evaluation land easier if the whole family already understands where things stand. I stood in my dark kitchen a long while after their voices finally quieted and a door closed somewhere in the cottage, my phone still recording an empty, settling silence, my own hands pressed flat against the cold countertop to steady myself. 22 minutes, the recording would later show, once I sat down with Dale to review it properly. 22 minutes of my son and his wife discussing, in specific deliberate language, exactly how they intended to have me declared incompetent, and exactly which family gathering they intended to use as the stage for announcing it. I did not cry that night, though I expected to. What I felt instead, standing alone in my kitchen with the recording saved and my phone finally, carefully powered off, was something closer to the particular stillness I used to feel on a job site the moment a stress test finally confirmed a flaw I'd suspected but hadn't yet been able to prove. I finally had my proof. And I now knew exactly which dinner I needed to be ready for. I hadn't told anyone in the family what I already knew. Dale had cautioned me against it firmly, in a conversation the day after I brought him the recording, walking him through the file on his office computer while he listened with the same careful, unhurried attention he gave to everything, occasionally pausing it to write something down, his expression growing steadily more grim as the 22 minutes played out. "This is strong evidence, Barbara," he told me once it finished. "Stronger than I expected, honestly. But I need you to resist the urge to confront them with it prematurely. If you reveal what you know before you're ready to act on it fully, you give them time to adjust their story, or worse, to accelerate whatever they're planning before you're prepared to counter it. Let them believe you know nothing. Let them walk into Thanksgiving exactly as confident as they are right now." I agreed, though it cost me more than I expected to sit across from Tyler at ordinary Sunday dinners over the following 2 weeks, watching him ask about my week with the same practiced warmth Brooke had coached him toward, knowing precisely what conversation was unfolding underneath every pleasant word. I said nothing. I smiled and asked about his week in return, and went home each time to sit with Dale's growing folder of documents, adding to it steadily, quietly, the way you'd reinforce a foundation one careful pour at a time. It was my niece Carrie who finally confirmed from an entirely separate direction exactly what I already knew was coming. Carrie was my late sister's daughter, 34 now, close enough to Tyler in age that the two of them had grown up more like siblings than cousins, close enough to me that she still called most weeks just to check in, a habit she'd kept faithfully since Frank's funeral. She showed up unannounced on a Tuesday evening in mid-November, still in her work clothes, with an expression on her face I recognized immediately as someone working up the nerve to say something difficult. "Aunt Barb," she said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking from, "I need to tell you something, and I don't fully know how to say it without it sounding awful, so I'm just going to say it plainly. Brooke called me last week. She asked if I'd noticed you seeming forgetful lately. Repeating yourself, getting confused about things." I kept my face carefully neutral, the way I'd practiced doing for 2 weeks straight at every Sunday dinner. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I hadn't noticed anything like that at all," Carrie said, "because I haven't, Aunt Barb. You're sharper than half the people I work with. But it wasn't just me. She's been calling around, Aunt Linda, your friend Margaret from the garden club, even Pastor Hollis, from what I heard secondhand. Always the same kind of question, always framed like she's worried about you rather than asking anything specific. It felt wrong the whole time she was asking me. I just didn't understand why until I heard she'd called Pastor Hollis too, and then it started feeling less like concern and more like she was building towards something. I reached across the table and took my niece's hand, grateful in that moment, for a kind of clarity I hadn't expected to receive from this particular direction. "You're right to feel that it's wrong," I told her. "I need to ask you something, Carrie, and I need you to trust me enough to simply do it without asking me to explain everything yet. Can you do that?" "Of course," she said without hesitation. "If anyone else calls you asking similar questions between now and Thanksgiving," I said, "I want you to tell them exactly what you told me, that you haven't noticed anything at all. And I want you to remember carefully everyone who asks and when." Carrie studied my face a long moment, the particular careful study of someone deciding whether to push for more information or trust that she'd been given exactly as much as she needed for now. "This is about the guest cottage, isn't it?" she finally said. "About Tyler and Brooke moving in. Something's happening, Aunt Barb, and I think I'd rather know what, so I can actually help instead of just noticing pieces of it secondhand." I considered for a long moment exactly how much to tell her. I settled in the end on enough truth to be honest with her without asking her to carry the full weight of everything I already knew. "Tyler and Brooke are in serious financial trouble," I told her. "And I believe they're considering asking a doctor to declare me incapable of managing my own affairs, so they can gain control of things that belong to me. I have reason to believe they may say something about it at Thanksgiving dinner in front of the whole family." Carrie's face went through several emotions in quick succession. Shock, then something closer to anger, and finally, a kind of steady resolve that reminded me, sharply and unexpectedly, of my own reflection in Dale's office weeks earlier. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Not what do you want me to pretend not to know. What do you actually need?" "I need you at that dinner," I told her. "And I need you to trust that whatever happens I have it handled, even if it doesn't look that way in the moment." She nodded slowly and reached across the table to squeeze my hand once hard before letting go. "I'll be there," she said. "And Aunt Barb, for what it's worth, whatever you're planning, I hope it's exactly as thorough as I think it probably is." I didn't tell her about the folder sitting in my car, or the transcript Dale and I had prepared together, or the trust documents already filed and finalized weeks earlier. I only told her quietly that Thanksgiving would answer most of her questions on its own, and that I needed her more than anything else, simply to be present and steady when it did. She promised she would be. I believed her completely, and for the first time in nearly 2 months, I let myself feel something close to ready. Thanksgiving arrived the way it always had at Birchwood Lane. The smell of turkey and sage filling the house Frank and I had built with our own hands. The good china set out on the table he'd made from that reclaimed barn oak, 12 places instead of the usual 6 or 8, because Carrie had brought her boyfriend this year and Aunt Linda had driven up from Springfield, and half the extended family I only saw twice a year had all, for reasons I understood better than any of them realized, chosen this particular Thanksgiving to attend. I brought my handbag to the table with me, which wasn't unusual on its own. I'd always kept it close during family gatherings, out of some old habit from years of needing reading glasses or a phone within reach. And I set it on the floor beside my chair, close enough that I could feel the weight of the folder inside it against my ankle throughout the meal. A small, steady reminder of everything the past 2 months had built toward. The meal itself passed almost peacefully. Tyler carved the turkey the way his father used to, a task I'd handed to him 3 years earlier without fully realizing at the time how much symbolic weight I'd attached to the gesture. Brooke complimented my stuffing with a warmth that, knowing what I now knew, struck me as almost impressive in its consistency. Carrie caught my eye once across the table, a small, steady look that told me she remembered exactly what I'd asked of her, and I gave her the smallest possible nod in return. It was over dessert, once most of the plates had been cleared and coffee was being poured, that Tyler stood up. He tapped his water glass with a spoon, the way you'd call a room to attention for a toast, and I felt the entire table's focus shift toward him, warm and expectant, the way families gather their attention for good news at Thanksgiving without ever imagining it might be anything else. "I wanted to say something," Tyler began, and I watched him glance briefly at Brooke, who gave him the faintest encouraging nod, the same coaching I'd heard through a cracked window 3 weeks earlier now playing out in front of an audience. "Brooke and I have been talking a lot as a family about what's best for everyone going forward. And it hasn't been an easy conversation. But we've come to a decision and we wanted to share it here with everyone so there's no confusion about where things stand." The table had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when they sense something is about to happen that doesn't match the occasion. Aunt Linda set down her coffee cup. Carrie's hand found her boyfriend's under the table, though her eyes stayed fixed on me. "We voted," Tyler said, and his voice had taken on a strange, rehearsed formality that made my chest ache even as I braced for exactly the words I already knew were coming. "Mom, you're no longer family. We have passed. The silence that followed was complete. I watched several relatives' faces shift through confusion into something closer to horror, watched Aunt Linda's mouth actually fall open, watched Carrie's jaw tighten in the particular way that told me she was holding herself back from saying something before I'd had my chance to. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice, though my heart was hammering hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I reached down beside my chair into my handbag and drew out the plain manila folder that had been sitting there through the entire meal, and I set it down gently on the table in front of my son. "Since we're voting tonight," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to come out, "here's mine." Tyler looked at the folder, then at me, confusion flickering across his face for the first time since he'd stood up. "What is this?" "Open it," I told him. "Everyone at this table deserves to understand exactly what's actually been happening in this family for the past 4 months, and I think it's only fair you're the one to read it to them, since you were so eager to make an announcement of your own tonight." He opened it slowly and I watched his face change as he worked through what was inside, page by page. The trust documents, dated and notarized, moving the house fully and permanently beyond any guardianship claim. The frozen account statement, the small recurring test transfers highlighted in yellow, dated back to August. And finally, beneath it all, a printed transcript, word for word, of 22 minutes recorded through a cracked cottage window on a cold November night. "You need to be specific with Dr. Ferris," I read aloud myself. Once it became clear Tyler couldn't find his voice to do it, my eyes fixed on my son rather than the page, because I had that particular line memorized by then whether I wanted it or not. "Tell him she's repeated herself in conversation. Tell him she left the stove on once. The exact details matter less than sounding certain when you say them." Brooke's face had gone completely white. Aunt Linda made a small, sharp sound of shock beside her. Carrie sat perfectly still, watching Tyler with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between betrayal and vindication. "We're not inventing a story from nothing," I continued, still reading, still watching my son's face crumble in real time in front of the entire family he'd just tried to convince he no longer needed. "We're just giving Dr. Ferris permission to see what he already expects to see." "Mom," Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper now, "please." "I let this play out for 4 months, I told him, setting the transcript down finally, my voice quiet but perfectly steady across the silent table. "Because I needed to know exactly how far you were willing to go before I decided what I needed to do about it. I know about the restaurant. I know about the $58,000 in debt. I know you and Brooke have been asking half this family whether I seem forgetful, building a story you needed people to already believe before you ever stood up here tonight." I looked around the table at each relative in turn, at faces still processing what they'd just watched unfold, before I turned back to my son one final time. "You said we voted and I've passed," I told him. "I'd like the record to reflect that I'm voting too, Tyler. And my vote is that you and Brooke will need to find somewhere else to live, starting this week." Nobody at that table said anything for what felt like a very long time after I finished speaking. Tyler sat frozen with the transcript still in his hands, staring down at his own words printed back at him in black and white. And Brooke had gone so pale I genuinely wondered for a moment whether she might actually faint. It was Aunt Linda who finally broke the silence, setting down her coffee cup with a click that seemed to echo through the whole room. "Barbara," she said, "is all of that true?" "Every word of it," I told her. "The trust is filed with the county. The bank has the account frozen on record. And that transcript is a recording I made myself legally of a conversation I overheard through an open window 3 weeks ago." I looked at Tyler again and found to my own surprise that I felt less anger in that moment than I expected to, and more of something quieter and sadder underneath it. "I didn't want any of this to happen in front of everyone. I want you to understand that. But you're the one who stood up first tonight and decided this needed an audience." Tyler didn't argue. He set the folder down slowly, and when he finally looked up at me, whatever confidence had carried him through his announcement minutes earlier had completely drained out of his face, replaced by something closer to the boy I remembered handing his father screws one at a time on a milk crate in that workshop. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said quietly. "I told Brooke I didn't want to make things up about you." "You didn't have to make anything up," I said. "You just had to decide whether you were willing to let her, and you did. That's the part one need you to sit with, Tyler, more than any of the rest of it." Brooke left the table first without a word to anyone, and I heard the front door close firmly behind her a few minutes later. Tyler followed not long after, pausing at the doorway to look back at me once, though I couldn't read whatever was in that look clearly enough to name it. The rest of the meal dissolved quietly after that, relatives murmuring goodbyes earlier than usual, Carrie staying behind to help me clear plates in a silence that felt, for the first time all evening, genuinely peaceful rather than strained. "I'm proud of you," she told me, drying a dish at my sink long after everyone else had gone. "I don't know if that's the right thing to say tonight, but I am." "It's exactly the right thing to say," I told her and meant it. Tyler and Brooke moved out of the guest cottage within the week, quietly without further confrontation, though I heard secondhand from Carrie that the restaurant debt had finally caught up with them entirely by the following spring, forcing a bankruptcy filing that had nothing left to do with me at all by that point. I didn't take satisfaction in that news the way I might have expected to months earlier, sitting in Dale's office learning the shape of what my son had built and nearly destroyed. I only felt a tired, settled kind of grief. The particular grief of watching someone you raised choose a harder road than the one you'd have gladly helped him find, if only he'd asked honestly instead of scheming for it. I sold the house on Birchwood Lane the following spring on my own terms, to a young family with 2 small children who reminded me, more than I expected, of Frank and me the year we first broke ground on that lot. I kept the level from his workshop, still perfectly balanced on its hook, and packed it carefully among the handful of things I couldn't bring myself to leave behind. I moved into a bright apartment on the north side of Chicago that spring, high enough up to see Lake Michigan from my kitchen window, and I found in that new smaller space a kind of peace I hadn't expected to feel this late in my life. I wrote Tyler one letter before I left Birchwood Lane for good, and I want to tell you plainly that it wasn't a letter of anger, though I'd certainly earned the right to write one. I told him I loved him the way I always would regardless of anything that had happened between us. I told him I understood fear does strange things to people, the same way grief had once done strange things to me. And I told him the door wasn't closed forever, that if he ever wanted to walk back through it honestly, ready to take responsibility rather than build another plan around avoiding it, I would still be his mother, standing on the other side, willing to listen. I haven't heard from him yet. I don't know if I will. But I sleep well most nights now, looking out over that lake, the level from Frank's workshop hanging on a hook by my own kitchen window, still perfectly balanced. I learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's simply an invitation for someone to take more than they'd ever have the courage to ask for honestly. What I gained in the end wasn't just my house or my independence, though both mattered more than I expected them to. It was the certainty, finally, that protecting myself and loving my son were never actually in conflict with each other. Only my own fear of believing that had ever made them feel that way.